Before the siege, before the hunger, and before the long winters became a test of survival, Leningrad was one of the largest cities in Europe. It stood on the banks of the Neva River in northwestern Russia, close to the Baltic Sea. For more than 2 centuries, the city had served as a center of industry, culture, and government. Wide avenues crossed its districts. Stone bridges connected islands scattered along the river. Ships moved through its ports, carrying goods between the Soviet Union and the outside world. The climate was demanding even in ordinary years. Winters arrived early and stayed for months. Temperatures often fell well below freezing. Snow and ice were familiar parts of daily life. Yet the city had long adapted to these conditions. Factories continued operating through the cold. Trams moved through snowy streets. Residents followed routines shaped by the northern seasons. By 1941, nearly 3 million people lived in Leningrad. Workers filled its factories. Students attended schools and universities. Families crowded into apartment buildings that overlooked canals and public squares. Museums, theaters, and libraries remained active. The city carried a reputation not only for its economic importance, but also for its cultural identity. From a distance, Leningrad appeared stable. The river flowed as it always had. Freight trains arrived from other regions of the Soviet Union. Markets remained open. Daily life continued according to familiar patterns. Few people could know that these routines were approaching their end. Within months, the city would become isolated from much of the country around it. The roads that supplied millions would disappear. Food would become scarce. Winter would return under very different circumstances, and the survival of an entire city would begin. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed the borders of the Soviet Union along a front that stretched for hundreds of miles. The attack came without warning. Within days, news of rapid German advances spread across the country. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded. Cities and towns fell one after another. Rail lines became crowded with military traffic. Refugees began moving eastward, away from the fighting. For the Soviet leadership, Leningrad held enormous importance. It was the country's second-largest city. It contained major factories, shipyards, military facilities, and transportation networks. Just as important was its symbolic value. The city had been the birthplace of the Russian Revolution and remained one of the most recognizable cities in the Soviet Union. German planners viewed Leningrad as a major objective. Capturing or destroying the city would remove an industrial center and deliver a powerful political victory. As summer progressed, the war moved steadily closer. Residents followed reports through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public announcements. Many men joined the armed forces. Others volunteered for local defense units. Factories began shifting toward military production. Civilian workers produced weapons, ammunition, and equipment needed at the front. Construction crews and volunteers worked to strengthen defenses around the city. Trenches were dug across the surrounding countryside. Anti-tank obstacles appeared along roads. Women, students, and elderly residents participated in building defensive positions. At the same time, daily life continued as much as possible. Trams still ran through the streets. Schools prepared for another academic year. Stores remained open. Many residents believed that the advancing German forces would eventually be stopped before reaching the city itself. Such optimism was not unusual. Throughout the Soviet Union, many expected the war to be difficult but temporary. Few civilians imagined that an entire modern city could be cut off from the outside world for years. By late summer, however, the military situation had become increasingly serious. German Army Group North continued advancing toward Leningrad. Towns and transportation hubs south of the city fell into German hands. Important rail connections were lost. Supply routes became less reliable with each passing week. The distance between the front lines and the city continued to shrink. Factories remained active. Workers reported for their shifts. Families continued their routines. Yet signs of uncertainty were becoming impossible to ignore. The war was no longer something happening far away. It was moving steadily toward Leningrad itself. By August 1941, the situation around Leningrad had changed dramatically. German forces continued advancing from the south and southwest. To the north, Finnish forces moved through territories lost during earlier conflicts with the Soviet Union. With each passing week, the space between these armies narrowed. Roads became crowded with military vehicles, civilians, and refugees. Trains arriving in the city carried soldiers and equipment, but increasingly fewer supplies. Important transportation routes were either damaged, captured, or under constant threat. The city was beginning to feel the pressure of encirclement. Soviet authorities organized large-scale evacuation efforts. Factories attempted to relocate machinery eastward. Children were sent away whenever transportation was available. But moving hundreds of thousands of people during a rapidly changing military crisis proved difficult. Many families became separated. Some parents remained behind to work in factories, while children left with evacuation groups. Others chose to stay together, believing the city would hold. Information was often incomplete. Decisions were made quickly and with limited knowledge of what would happen next. As German forces approached, artillery fire could occasionally be heard in distant parts of the city. Air raid sirens became a regular feature of daily life. Bomb shelters filled during attacks. Residents learned to recognize the sound of aircraft overhead. Even then, many hoped the situation would stabilize. Instead, it continued to worsen. On September 8, 1941, German forces captured the town of Schlüsselburg on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. The event carried enormous significance. With that capture, Leningrad's last direct land connection to the rest of the Soviet Union was cut. The city was effectively surrounded. Inside the encirclement were approximately 2.5 to 3 million civilians, along with hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The population included factory workers, government employees, children, students, and elderly residents. They now faced a future that few could fully understand. The siege had begun. Although some limited connections remained across Lake Ladoga, the normal systems that supplied a modern city were gone. Railroads no longer brought regular shipments of food. Road traffic was interrupted. Warehouses could not easily be replenished. Leningrad suddenly found itself dependent on whatever resources already existed within the city. At first, many residents expected the siege to last weeks, perhaps months. Few imagined it would continue for more than 2 years. Yet as autumn approached, one reality became increasingly clear. The city was no longer waiting for rescue. It was preparing to survive alone. The first weeks of the siege brought uncertainty. The weeks that followed brought something more dangerous: a shortage of food. Leningrad had entered the siege with reserves stored throughout the city. These supplies were never intended to support millions of people during a prolonged isolation. They were meant to bridge temporary disruptions, not sustain an entire population cut off from regular deliveries. Then, on September 8th, the same day the encirclement was completed, German air raids struck several locations across the city. Among the targets were the Bediv warehouses, one of Leningrad's major food storage facilities. The destruction of the warehouses quickly became one of the most remembered events of the siege. Although historians continue to debate exactly how much food was lost, the psychological impact was immediate. Many residents watched smoke rise over the city and understood that valuable supplies had vanished. Food was already becoming scarce. Now it seemed even more limited. Authorities responded by introducing rationing systems. Every resident received food based on category. Factory workers, soldiers, office employees, and dependents all received different allocations. At first, the reductions appeared manageable. Then the rations shrank again. And again, bread became the center of daily survival. People measured their days around the moment they could collect their allotted portion. Long lines formed outside distribution points. Conversations increasingly focused on food, calories, and the next ration announcement. As autumn advanced, supplies continued declining. Fresh vegetables became rare. Meat nearly disappeared from ordinary diets. Stores that once served busy neighborhoods stood nearly empty. Meanwhile, winter approached. For residents of Leningrad, winter was never a minor inconvenience. The city was accustomed to freezing temperatures and heavy snow. But winter during a siege represented something entirely different. Cold increased the body's need for energy. Food was becoming harder to obtain. The combination would prove devastating. By November 1941, ration levels reached some of the lowest points of the entire siege. For many civilians, daily food allowances fell far below what was necessary for basic health. People began losing weight. Workers struggled to complete physical labor. Walking long distances became increasingly difficult. The crisis was no longer temporary. The city had crossed an invisible threshold. For millions of people trapped behind the siege lines, survival was becoming the central fact of everyday life. By the end of November 1941, Leningrad was entering what would become the deadliest winter of the siege. The city had already been isolated for months. Food supplies were critically low. Heating systems struggled to function. Fuel reserves were running out. As temperatures dropped, the problems began to reinforce one another. Cold demanded energy. Energy required food. Food was disappearing. Winter settled over the city with unusual severity. Temperatures frequently fell far below freezing. Snow-covered streets, courtyards, and rooftops. The Neva River gradually froze. Water pipes stopped functioning in many districts. Electricity became unreliable. Daily life changed completely. For many residents, the day began before sunrise. The first task was often finding water. With plumbing systems damaged or frozen, people traveled to rivers, canals, and holes cut through ice. Buckets had to be carried home by hand. Even this simple activity became difficult. Months of inadequate nutrition had weakened much of the population. Carrying water, climbing stairs, or walking several blocks required significant effort. Bread remained the primary source of food. Yet by late November, civilian bread rations had fallen to their lowest levels. Some categories of residents received only 125 grams per day, roughly the weight of a small bar of soap. Even that bread was not always made entirely from flour. To stretch supplies, bakeries mixed in substitutes. Various fillers were added to increase volume and conserve grain reserves. The resulting bread provided calories, but often little satisfaction. People adjusted their routines around these realities. Many limited movement to preserve energy. Tasks were carefully planned to avoid unnecessary exertion. Residents learned to sit still for long periods because every movement consumed calories that could not easily be replaced. Apartments became colder with each passing week. Without sufficient fuel, furniture, books, and wooden household items were sometimes burned for heat. Families gathered in single rooms to conserve warmth. Windows were covered whenever possible. Extra clothing was worn indoors. Factories continued operating despite the conditions. Workers reported for duty even as food shortages worsened. Industrial production remained important to the Soviet war effort, and maintaining output became a priority. Some employees traveled considerable distances on foot through snow-covered streets. Transportation systems gradually slowed. Many trams stopped running. Streets that had once been crowded with commuters became noticeably quieter. The city's normal rhythms disappeared. Hospitals filled with patients suffering from malnutrition, exhaustion, and cold-related illnesses. Doctors worked under the same difficult conditions as everyone else. Medical supplies were limited. Resources were stretched thin. As December approached, deaths increased sharply. The causes were rarely dramatic. People weakened gradually. Hunger reduced physical strength. Cold increased strain on the body. Illnesses that might once have been survivable became far more dangerous. The first winter of the siege was becoming a test of endurance unlike anything the city had experienced before. And it was only beginning. As the winter of 1941 to 1942 continued, the ration card became one of the most important objects in Leningrad. Without it, obtaining food was nearly impossible. Every resident depended on a system that determined how much food they would receive and when they would receive it. The card represented access to survival itself. Losing one could have severe consequences. Replacements were difficult to obtain, and many people guarded their ration cards with extraordinary care. The amount of food available depended on a person's category. Factory workers generally received larger rations because their labor was considered essential to the city's defense and industry. Office workers, dependents, children, and elderly residents received less. Even so, the quantities remained dangerously small. Most people spent a large part of each day thinking about food. Conversations often revolved around ration levels, distribution schedules, and rumors of incoming supplies. Memories of ordinary meals became increasingly vivid. Many residents recorded these experiences in diaries. The surviving accounts reveal a population focused on practical concerns. How much bread remained, whether a distribution center would open on time, how far someone could walk before exhaustion forced them to stop. Food substitutes became increasingly common. When conventional supplies were unavailable, various alternatives appeared. Soups were made from ingredients that would rarely have been considered food before the siege. Anything capable of providing calories gained value. Yet survival required more than finding something to eat. The city still had to function. Factories continued producing weapons, ammunition, and military equipment. Workers reported to their stations despite hunger and freezing temperatures. Many performed physically demanding labor, while consuming only a fraction of the calories normally required for such work. The effort came at a cost. Productivity often depended less on skill than on physical endurance. Every task required energy that many workers no longer possessed. Still, production continued. Government institutions remained active as well. Distribution networks operated despite shortages. Officials tracked supplies, managed rationing, and organized deliveries whenever possible. Maintaining order became a survival strategy in itself. Without organization, the city's limited resources could have disappeared even faster. Distribution systems, however imperfect, allowed millions of people to receive at least some food. Schools closed at times and reopened when conditions allowed. Certain cultural institutions continued operating in limited forms. Libraries remained open. Small concerts and public events occasionally took place. To an outside observer, these activities might have seemed insignificant. Inside Leningrad, they served another purpose. They preserved routines. Routines created structure, and structure helped people endure. The city was no longer waiting for normal life to return next week or next month. By early 1942, many residents understood that survival would depend on patience, discipline, and adaptation over a much longer period. The siege had become a way of life. And somehow, despite everything, the city continued to function. During the first winter of the siege, one route became more important than any other. It crossed Lake Ladoga. The lake lay to the east of Leningrad, beyond the German encirclement. It represented the city's only remaining connection to the rest of the Soviet Union. Without it, the population trapped inside the siege would have faced even greater shortages. As autumn turned into winter, Soviet planners searched for ways to move supplies across the lake. When the water was open, boats carried food, fuel, and other necessities. These journeys were dangerous. German aircraft regularly attacked shipping routes, and storms could make travel difficult. But the arrival of winter created a new possibility. As temperatures dropped, the surface of Lake Ladoga began to freeze. Engineers carefully monitored the ice. At first, only small movements were possible. Eventually, sections became thick enough to support vehicles. A route was established across the frozen lake. It became known as the Road of Life. Trucks traveled over the ice carrying flour, grain, fuel, and other supplies toward Leningrad. On return journeys, they transported civilians out of the city whenever space allowed. The work was dangerous. Drivers operated in severe weather conditions. Snowstorms reduced visibility. Cracks occasionally appeared in the ice. Vehicles sometimes broke through weak sections and disappeared into the freezing water below. German artillery and aircraft also threatened the route. Despite these dangers, the convoys continued. Each truck represented something larger than its cargo. It represented time. Every shipment delayed the effects of starvation. Every successful journey increased the city's chances of enduring another week, another month, another season. The route did not solve all of Leningrad's problems. The amount of food entering the city remained limited compared to the needs of millions of people. Hunger continued. Deaths continued. Shortages remained severe. Yet conditions slowly began to improve. Additional supplies reached bakeries. Fuel deliveries increased. Evacuations removed some civilians from the city, reducing pressure on resources. The worst ration levels of the winter gradually became less common. The Road of Life became one of the most significant logistical operations of the siege. Its existence depended on engineers, drivers, laborers, soldiers, and countless others working under difficult conditions. Many of their names were never widely recorded. What remained visible was the result. Leningrad was still suffering, but it was no longer completely cut off. Across a frozen lake, a fragile connection had been established. And for a city fighting starvation, that connection meant survival was still possible. By the spring of 1942, Leningrad had already survived what many believed would be impossible. The first winter had passed. Hundreds of thousands had died from starvation, disease, and exposure. Entire neighborhoods had been transformed by loss. Yet the city remained standing. For those who survived, daily life entered a different phase. The shock of the siege gradually gave way to routine. The danger had not disappeared. Food remained limited. German artillery still reached parts of the city. Air raids continued, but people adapted to conditions that had once seemed unimaginable. Survival became organized. Residents learned exactly how to manage their energy. Every walk had a purpose. Every calorie mattered. Tasks were planned carefully. Waste became rare. The arrival of warmer weather brought some relief. Ice disappeared from waterways. Transportation improved. Additional supplies could move across Lake Ladoga by boat. Gardens began appearing throughout the city. Parks, courtyard, and open spaces were converted into areas for growing vegetables. Any source of food had value. Factories continued operating despite the hardship. Workers produced tanks, artillery shells, ammunition, and military equipment, while the siege continued around them. Many employees remained underweight and physically weakened, yet industrial production never completely stopped. The city also protected parts of its cultural life. Libraries remained open. Schools resumed classes whenever conditions allowed. Museums safeguarded collections. Musicians continued performing despite the shortages. One of the most remarkable examples occurred in August 1942. That month, composer Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony was performed in Leningrad while the siege was still underway. Many musicians had died, evacuated, or become too weak to perform. Additional players were gathered from military units to complete the orchestra. The performance became a symbol of endurance, not because it changed the military situation, but because it demonstrated that life inside the city had not completely disappeared. Community support also played a role in survival. Neighbors shared information, assisted family members, and helped one another whenever possible. Such efforts varied from place to place, but they helped many endure conditions that would have been even more difficult alone. By late 1942, the siege was no longer measured only in days. It was measured in habits. People woke, worked, searched for food, waited for rations, and endured. The extraordinary had become ordinary, and that may have been one of the most important reasons the city survived. By the end of 1942, Leningrad had endured more than a year under siege. The city had adapted, but adaptation did not erase the cost. The winter of 1941 to 1942 had been particularly devastating. Starvation became one of the primary causes of death. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, reduced physical strength, and made ordinary illnesses far more dangerous. Many residents lost significant amounts of weight. Doctors recorded widespread cases of severe exhaustion. Workers who had once spent long hours in factories now struggled with simple physical tasks. Climbing stairs, carrying water, or walking across the city could require enormous effort. Hospitals remained under pressure. Medical staff worked with limited resources while treating large numbers of patients. The challenge was not a single disease, but the cumulative effect of hunger, cold, and physical decline. Families experienced the siege in different ways. Some households lost one member, others lost several. In many cases, evacuations separated relatives for months or years. Letters moved slowly when they moved at all. Information was often incomplete. Many people simply did not know whether family members elsewhere were alive. Psychological pressure accumulated over time. Unlike a sudden disaster, the siege unfolded day after day, month after month. There was no clear endpoint. Residents continued their routines while surrounded by uncertainty. The passing of time became difficult to measure. Seasons changed. Winters came and went. Yet many aspects of daily life remained the same. Ration cards, food lines, air raids, and shortages continued to shape existence. Even those who survived carried visible signs of the ordeal. Malnutrition affected physical development in children. Long periods of stress and deprivation left lasting health consequences for many adults. Recovery would take years. Yet despite the losses, the city continued functioning. Factories remained active. Schools operated when possible. Supply routes continued bringing food and fuel. Life persisted alongside hardship. The siege had become more than a military operation. It had become a test of how long a population could endure under conditions that would have seemed impossible before the war. And the test was not over yet. As 1943 began, the people of Leningrad entered another year's siege. The city was no longer facing the catastrophic conditions of the first winter, but hardship remained a constant presence. Food supplies had improved compared to the darkest months of 1941 and early 1942. Even so, shortages continued to affect nearly every aspect of life. The war still surrounded the city. German positions remained close enough for artillery bombardments. Air raids occurred throughout the year. Civilians had learned to live with interruptions that once would have caused panic. By now, many residents had spent so long under siege that memories of ordinary life felt distant. The routines of survival had become normal. People woke before dawn. They collected rations. They reported for work. They repaired damaged buildings. They waited in lines. They conserved energy whenever possible. The passage of time became difficult to track emotionally. Months blended together. One winter followed another. Announcements about military operations brought hope, but few people could predict when the siege would finally end. In January 1943, Soviet forces launched Operation Iskra. The offensive succeeded in opening a narrow land corridor to the city. For the first time since September 1941, Leningrad gained a direct connection to Soviet-controlled territory. The breakthrough was important. New rail lines were constructed. Supplies moved more efficiently. Conditions gradually improved. Yet the siege itself continued. The city remained under threat, and many of the hardships persisted. For those still living in Leningrad, survival remained a daily responsibility. The difference was that, for the first time in many months, there were signs that the long isolation might not last forever. After enduring more than a year of starvation, cold, and uncertainty, the possibility of an end had finally become visible. Throughout 1943, Soviet forces continued applying pressure along the front around Leningrad. The narrow corridor opened during Operation Iskra improved the city situation, but it did not completely remove the danger. Artillery bombardments continued. Military operations remained active across the region. The siege had been weakened, but it had not yet been broken. Inside the city, life slowly became more stable. Food deliveries increased. Transportation improved. Factories continued producing military equipment. Schools and public services operated more consistently than they had during the earlier years of the blockade. Yet the signs of the siege were everywhere. Damaged buildings remained scattered across the city. Many families were missing relatives who had died, been evacuated, or disappeared during the long years of war. Then, in January 1944, the situation changed decisively. Soviet offensives forced German forces to retreat from positions surrounding the city. After months of preparation and fighting, the military pressure that had trapped Leningrad for so long finally began to collapse. On January 27, 1944, the siege was officially lifted. The blockade had lasted 872 days. For nearly 2.5 years, millions of civilians had lived under conditions of extreme hardship. They had endured starvation, freezing winters, bombardment, and isolation. Now the city was connected once again to the wider Soviet Union. There were celebrations in some places, and official ceremonies marking the event. But for many survivors, the moment was quieter. The siege was over. The losses remained, and the task of rebuilding life was only beginning. When the siege ended, Leningrad was still standing. Its factories remained. Its bridges still crossed the Neva. Its streets were once again connected to the rest of the country. But the population had changed. Hundreds of thousands of civilians had died during the blockade. Many others had been evacuated. Those who remained carried the physical and psychological effects of years of deprivation. They had survived, not unchanged, simply alive. The siege of Leningrad remains one of the longest and deadliest sieges in modern history. For 872 days, a major city endured isolation, hunger, cold, and war. Its survival was not the result of a single heroic moment, but of countless ordinary decisions repeated day after day: to eat a little less, to keep working, to endure another winter. When the siege ended, silence remained where millions of lives had been changed forever.